In this video, we will do something little different. Instead of talking about the different aspects of the Shunga history, we will look at how historians have tried to reconstruct the Shunga history and what are some of the problems associated with it. Now, before talking about the sources that are used for writing the Shunga history, let's just have an overview of this history. So we are told that around 187 BC, or in some books you will find the date 184 BC, the last Mauryan emperor Brihadrat was killed by his military general whose name was Pushyamitra Shunga. So after killing this last Mauryan emperor, Pushyamitra Shunga seizes the Mauryan throne and he starts the Shunga Dynasty. And we are told that the reign of Pushyamitra Shunga lasted for 36 years. In this long reign of 36 years, we are told that he clashed with the Greeks. He also performed Ashwamedh sacrifice. So these are some of the details about Pushyamitra Shunga. Now let's look at what are the sources which historians have used to reconstruct this history. So let's start our analysis with the date first. So the date of the killing of last Mauryan emperor Brihadrat is 187 BC, or in some books you will find the date 184 BC. So these two dates are because in the Puranas we are told that the Mauryas ruled for a total of 137 years. Now based on the Buddhist chronicles, we have two dates for the accession of Chandragupta's Maurya. So the two dates are 324 BC and 321 BC. So based on these two dates, we have the date of the last Mauryan ruler when he was assassinated. So that is why we have the date 187 BC and 184 BC. Now when it comes to the fact that Pushyamitra Shunga assassinated the Mauryan emperor Brihadrat, we know this from the Puranas. And apart from the Puranas, we find that in the biography of Harshvardhan, the emperor who ruled in 7th century AD, we find that in his biography, which is called Harshcharitra, here it is also mentioned that Pushyamitra Shunga had assassinated the Mauryan emperor Brihadrat. So from these two sources, we know that Pushyamitra Shunga had killed the Mauryan emperor Brihadrat. Now when it comes to the period of Pushyamitra Shunga, we find that there is no inscription that he had commissioned. But there is an inscription in which the name Pushyamitra appears. This inscription comes from Ayodhya and particularly from the main temple of Shri Udasin Rishi Ashram. So on the pedestal of this temple, we have an inscription which was commissioned by someone called Dhana. So Dhana in this inscription tells us that he was the king of Kosala, and he describes himself as sixth of the Senapati Pushyamitra who had performed the Ashwamedh twice. Now if we analyze this inscription, the phrase sixth of the Pushyamitras is first very important, and it could be viewed in two different ways. We could say that here sixth of the Senapati Pushyamitra means that Dhana was the sixth brother of Senapati Pushyamitra, and it could also mean that Dhana was the sixth descendant of Senapati Pushyamitra. Now if we analyze the script that is used to write this inscription, we find that the script is close to the Kushan Brahmi script. So it appears that this inscription is of a later date than the period of Pushyamitra Shunga. So it means that the interpretation that Dhana was the sixth descendant of Senapati Pushyamitra is more plausible. And from this we also learn that this Senapati Pushyamitra had performed the Vedic sacrifice of Ashwamedh twice. Then we also see that there is another source in which a sacrifice has been mentioned that was performed by Pushyamitra. The source which mentions this is Patanjali's Mahabhashya. So in Patanjali's Mahabhashya, when Patanjali describes or gives an example of an act that has begun but has not finished yet, he gives the example Iha Pushyamitram Yajayamaha, which means here we are performing the sacrifice for Pushyamitra. So from this single line, we can deduce two important facts. First, that this sacrifice which Patanjali is mentioning is most likely the sacrifice of Ashwamedh that is also mentioned in the inscription of Dhana. Then the second fact which we can deduce is the fact that most likely Patanjali and Pushyamitra Shunga were both contemporaries. This can be said from the fact that when Patanjali says that here we are performing the sacrifice of Pushyamitra, he is talking about the present time, which means that Patanjali and the period of Pushyamitra Shunga is the same. So from these two sources, we know that Pushyamitra Shunga had performed the Vedic sacrifice of Ashwamedh. Now the question comes is, what was the reason behind this sacrifice? So we are told that the reason why Pushyamitra Shunga had performed the Vedic sacrifice of Ashwamedh was because he had defeated the Greek armies that was invading during this time. The information of this Greek invasion is present in two sources. First is Patanjali's Mahabhashya and the second is Yuga Puran. So when we look at Patanjali's Mahabhashya, so when Patanjali has to provide an example of an event that has recently occurred, he gives the example of the attack of Yavana on the city of Saket. Saket is Ayodhya. So from this it appears that when Patanjali was writing his Mahabhashya, the Greeks had just attacked the city of Saket. Now this information of this Greek invasion is also mentioned in Yuga Puran, and Yuga Puran tells us that after attacking the city of Saket, Panchal and Mathura, the Yavanas are now attacking the city of Patliputra. So this information, and if we collaborate this information with the information present in Patanjali, it appears that both of these sources are talking about the same invasion. So it appears that after conquering Mathura, then Panchal and finally conquering the city of Saket, the Yavanas or the Greeks attacked the city of Patliputra. Now we know that Patanjali and Pushyamitra Shunga were both contemporaries. So Patanjali is describing the Greek invasion of Saket as a contemporary event that has recently occurred. So this means that this invasion of the Yavanas that is mentioned in Patanjali's Mahabhashya and also in Yuga Puran happened when Pushyamitra Shunga was ruling, and we are told from Yuga Puran that the Greeks had managed to conquer the city of Patliputra. But they did not remain in this city for long because of their infighting. So we can say that when the Greeks retreated and Pushyamitra Shunga was able to reconquer the city of Patliputra, he performed the Vedic sacrifice of Ashwamedh. Now there is another source which historians use to write Shunga history, and this is Malvika Agnimitram of Kalidas. Now this work of Kalidas revolves around Agnimitra, who was the second king of the Shungas, and he was also the son of Pushyamitra Shunga. And in this text we find that this Greek invasion of Patliputra is not mentioned. So this is the problem with this source also. So it appears that to reconstruct the major events of Pushyamitra Shunga's reign, historians have used three sources. First is Patanjali's Mahabhashya, where two lines have been used. The first line where the sacrifice is mentioned and the second line is the attack of Saket by the Greeks. Then we see that the Greek invasion that is mentioned in Yuga Puran have been used, and finally the inscription of Dhana in Ayodhya has been used by historians to write Shunga history. Then we find that in Malvika Agnimitram, as we have discussed, the information about Pushyamitra Shunga is present. But we are not sure how reliable this information is, because when we look at this Greek invasion of Patliputra, this is not mentioned in Malvika Agnimitram. So we do not have other sources from which we can cross-check the evidence that is mentioned in Malvika Agnimitram. So using Malvika Agnimitram is less reliable. Now apart from this, when we look at the territory which was controlled by Pushyamitra Shunga, we have two sources which presents us two different views. So first are the Puranas that tells us that Pushyamitra Shunga controlled Kosal, Vidisha and Magad, whereas the Buddhist sources tell us that Pushyamitra Shunga's territory extended up to Punjab. So these two different sources presents us two entirely different perspective about the territory which was controlled by Pushyamitra Shunga. Now we do not have other sources to see whether the Puranas are right or the Buddhist sources are right. And when we look at the sources which we use to reconstruct the Shunga history as a whole, we find that most of our sources are literary sources. We have only one inscription that I have mentioned. So this makes the job of historians quite difficult, and we find that historians have to make lot of assumptions. And the most important assumption which historians have made is the assumption that the state bureaucratic setup and the state machinery that existed in the Mauryan period had survived up to the Shunga period. We do not have enough sources to support this assumption, but historians have made this assumption nonetheless. So based on this, it is quite clear that we do not know enough about the Shunga history. Now, the evidence from coins or the numismatic evidence has not been discussed yet. You can watch this podcast which I had done in my second channel, where I have talked about this evidence in great detail. So please watch this podcast. Thank you for watching.